All right, thank you guys for being here today. I'd like to introduce Derek Risch. Derek is a wildlife ecologist with expertise in quantitative methods, including ecological modeling, spatial prioritization, and GIS analysis for conservation and land management. He received his master's degree here at UH from the Hawaii Wildlife Ecology Lab in 2019, and his current research centers on the ecology and management of invasive mammals in Hawaii, with an emphasis on understanding how environmental and human-driven factors shape their distribution and impacts. Derek's work supports the development of science-based strategies to mitigate ecological damage, protect native ecosystems, and inform sustainable ungulate management across the islands.
Thanks. Do I need to put the mic up or is this? No. All right, thank you for that great introduction. And now that you have some background about my wildlife side of things, I'm going to pivot and completely talk about something else. Talk about recreational trails. And before I do, I did want to say I hope everyone's been staying safe. There's been a lot of bad weather lately, a lot of flooding. I know a lot of people are dealing with a lot right now, and so I hope you all are doing well. And if you are impacted, the recovery efforts are going. But today I'm going to talk about some of the recreational trail research that we've been working on over the last 2 to 3 years, and share some of the results out today. I want to thank all of the co-authors listed there who have been a huge help in getting this work done and kind of bringing everything together. And I'm going to share really quick. Everybody else, a huge thank you to all of these folks, in particular Hawaii DLNR, and especially the Na'alahele staff. So Na'alahele is the Trail and Access Program, and they've dedicated a lot of time and effort in getting us up to speed on things so that the research that we're doing is most relevant to the kind of management and things that they do on the ground. And really trying to pair the research we do here at UH with managers on the ground so that it's most relevant to what they do. I also want to thank folks over at UHERO, Scheidler College of Business, and the Hawaii Tourism Authority. A big aspect of this work is like trying to deal with humans and human use and things like that. And that's kind of new for me, having a background in wildlife. And so partnering with those folks was essential in understanding what kind of information we can gather on human use. I wanted to take the funding originating from the U.S. Economic Development Administration, passing down through the Hawaii system and eventually landing here at UH. And so with that, I'll give a broad overview because I'm only really presenting an aspect of a much larger project that we're doing here at UH in the Natural Resources and Environmental Department. And so it's really kind of this larger research project with these 3 different components. And today I'm really only going to be presenting the trail vulnerability assessment, which is the part of the project that I'm leading, and it really, at the core, is addressing this question of where do we take action. So where do we take these management actions as it relates to recreational trails? My colleague, Dr. Kristen Harmon, is leading the trail actions decision analysis side of the project, and the core questions being answered through that line of research is which actions do we take, and how much does it cost? And then finally, we have an whole economics team led by Dr. Ashley Lowe-McKenzie and Dr. Kirsten Olson, and we have Valdo in the house here as well, who's a graduate student working on that part of the project, and really trying to address this question of how do we pay for it. And so that's the larger project. Again, today I'm only presenting on one component of this larger project. Valdo actually has a seminar talk coming up, and I'll put a plug in at the end if you all wanted to join that in a few weeks. So thinking about recreational trails and outdoor recreation more generally, I wanted to start with kind of some background about outdoor recreation in Hawaii as it stands, because at the outset of this project, having a background in wildlife and many of you in natural resources and environmental management, I didn't really have a good understanding of outdoor recreation more broadly. I hiked a bunch of trails and spent a lot of time outside, but I didn't really understand it as a sector of our economy. And so if we look at it by the numbers, Hawaii actually ranks the highest in the nation out of any state by percentage of our GDP. So in Hawaii, about 6 or a little over 6% of our GDP or our basically our economy is owing to outdoor recreation related things. And that's the equivalent of about $6.9 billion a year, which is a huge number. And that supports a little over 49,000 jobs, or 7% of all employees in the state. And top industries include guided tours, boating, fishing, hunting, shooting, hiking is a component of that as well. And I bring up these numbers because I think it provides context to the title of this talk, being Paradise or Paradox. And I want you all to think as I go through this presentation and think about how many of those overall jobs do you think are jobs that help steward and manage these spaces? And so we have potentially a lot of jobs that benefit off of our natural resources, but how many of those jobs actually help steward and manage those spaces in a sustainable way? And so there's really no question as to why outdoor recreation is such a big sector of our economy. We have nearly 10 million visitors to Hawaii each year. And it's because of places like this. We have incredible natural resources. This is on Kauai, but we have waterfalls. We have some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. And you see pictures like this on brochures and tourism magazines everywhere. And what you might not notice or what you might not see in those brochures and magazines is kind of the impact that we have on these spaces. And so if you're not familiar with trails, that trail, if it was managed in a sustainable in a good way, it shouldn't be that wide. We shouldn't have these really wide trails that are overused and that soil is really exposed. And so you can imagine with all this rain that we're having, that next rainfall really creates a lot of issues here. And so trying to understand outdoor recreation and trails in particular, but also the impact that we're having on these trails. And so getting to who manages them, the Na'alehele Trail and Access Program is the principal agency managing public trails across the state. They're not the only one, but they have the largest mandate for trail management across the state. And you would think that they'd be a huge benefactor of that, $6.9 billion industry, but really they only have anywhere between 2 and 3 full-time professionals for each county across the state. And they manage over 150 plus program trails. That's the equivalent of 500 plus miles of trails across 1 million plus acres. And that's not even mentioning all of the non-program trails. And so if you go, I won't get super into specifics, but if you go on their website, they have all of the program trails that they list. But if you go on, web sources like All Trails, there's a whole host of other trails out there that aren't designated program trails. And they do an excellent job for the limited resources that they have. And so we're partnering with them, and we got some grant money to do some research, and we wanted to see how we could best support them. And one of the things we identified early on, and myself being kind of a spatial person and a GIS person, is trying to pull in data that might help inform decisions. And one of the things we recognized early on when talking with folks is that they don't have capacity to go out and survey every trail on any regular basis to see, what are the current conditions, what kind of management should we do in these spaces. They have potentially thousands of miles of trail under their mandate. And so this was really kind of the driving question is can we look across our trails using existing data without having to go out and do systematic surveys in the field, which are really exhaustive and take a lot of time? Can we use existing spatial data to help inform this idea of trail being in a good condition to a poor condition there and across that spectrum? And so what we kind of came up with is this idea of trail vulnerability. And we were brainstorming, we were talking with a bunch of the Na'alehele people and amongst ourselves and looking at published studies and literature. And it's pretty complicated, actually, if you think about trail vulnerability and all the things that go into trail degradation. And so one of the main things that we all see every day and hear about is human use. So there's obviously some kind of anthropogenic aspect that contributes to trail vulnerability. So we need to consider that. Naturally, when we think about humans and hiking, we see erosion and we think of soil. So we need to consider things like soil properties, like particle size. The soil type is a big contributor to how vulnerable that trail is to degradation. We also need to consider ecological factors. We all know that plants reduce erosional rates, and we need to consider that when we're thinking about the conditions on the trail. And I'm building out this equation at the top there for simplistic terms, but it can get really complicated. We need to consider topographical things, and there's all of these things that we need to consider. Climate, hydrology, and that gets pretty overwhelming pretty quickly when we start thinking about this. And this is where we were 2 or 3 years ago trying to think about this problem, what kind of data we need to pull in to help inform these kinds of decisions. And not only do they all feed into trail vulnerability, obviously they all kind of interact with one another. So really this huge task of trying to sort through data and answer ultimately this question of trail vulnerability. And so we wanted to kind of come up with key driving research questions that might help us simplify that complicated model. And one of those questions was, where are recreational trails most vulnerable to degradation? And this isn't just like which trails are most vulnerable to degradation, this is also which like sections of trails are vulnerable to degradation, because we need to know, okay, we need to know that this trail is problematic, but we also need to know which sections or what parts of that trail are problematic so that we can do targeted management. We also want to know what are the primary drivers of trail vulnerability. So are they, rainfall related things? Are they human use related things? We really wanted to understand that because management actions are catered to the drivers of trail vulnerability. So if, the amount of use is a problem on that trail, you might not do a certain type of action. You really want to do an action that's focused on limiting use or preventing more damage from overuse. And finally, we wanted to look at how can these insights be used to prioritize and implement trail management interventions. And so really pairing the data with the types of management that's going to be occurring on the trail. So I'm going to provide our mental model for how we approach this and the kinds of data that we acquired and used to get at this idea of trail vulnerability. And we basically came up with 3 core categories that are important from a trail vulnerability standpoint, being trail use, trail design, and natural soil loss. And I'm going to walk you through the data that goes into each of those, and we're going to start with trail use. And the 2 key components for trail use is the type of use happening on the trail and the amount of use happening on the trail. So type of use, there's been a lot of published studies and research into looking at different types of use and how it impacts trail erosional rates and things like that. And we use that published literature to basically go systematically through all of the Na'alahele program trails and assign a weighted ranking for each trail based on the use designation. So if it was a 4-wheel drive trail, for example, it got a higher score than a trail that was foot traffic only, because in published studies, 4-wheel drive trails were the highest problem from an erosional standpoint. So we went through all of those, fairly straightforward. And that designation. Amount of use was actually a really hard one to get at. And so we were fortunate enough to acquire some cell phone data through partnering with UHERO and the Hawaii Tourism Authority, who had some agreements with some data vendors. And so we got cell phone data for 2022, 2023, and 2024. And so what you're seeing right now is basically the trail network in the Manoa Valley area. And you can see basically how busy trails are on a yellow to red spectrum or palette. And so we have that data across all 150 plus Na'alahele program trails. And we were able to get aggregated counts on an annual basis for visitation to all of the trails. So that's trail use. If we're thinking about trail design, these are kind of engineering aspects, if you want to think about it. So trail grade and trail slope alignment angle. Trail grade, pretty straightforward. The slope of the trail, not too complicated, this one. And so here's an example from the Alakai Swamp Trail. On the left side of the video here, you can see there's bits of red sections of that trail. Basically, that trail dips in and out of a bunch of valleys there in the beginning, and so there's pretty steep sections, potentially problematic from a trail vulnerability standpoint, but then it kind of gets into the Alakai Plateau and gets a little flatter there, so you see shades of green, so potentially not as problematic if we're thinking about trail grade. And so we had calculated data across all of the 150 plus program trails for the trail grade information there. Trail slope alignment angle is a little more complicated to understand, but I'm going to try and simplify it here. We have a trail on the left, which we can call a side hill trail, and the trail on the right, which we can call a fall aligned trail. And basically everything related to trail slope alignment angle has to do with gravity and water. Where is the water going to go? And so this trail on the left, if we look at the trail profile, it basically the underlying slope goes straight down, and then the trail is cut into the side of the hill, and then it goes straight down again. Whereas this trail on the right goes straight up the slope, and so we get these deep kind of gullies. And if we think about next time it rains, this trail on the left, the water is going to go down slope, spend very little time on the trail, and quickly sheet off and continue going down slope. Whereas this trail on the right, it's going to be a catchment for all of the rain, and it's basically going to go straight down slope, and you're going to get these kind of deep gullies that you'll pretty often see on ridge hikes and other types of hikes across the state. And so here's a quick example from a trail on Oahu. This is Kuli'o'o Trail. You can see the bottom of that trail has switchbacks and is colored in yellow, and that's because the trail slope alignment angle there is actually really good. So we want those kinds of switchbacks going up the hill. That whole portion of that trail is a side hill trail. And then once we get up on the ridge, we're basically going straight up slope. And so that's going to be a fall aligned portion of the trail, and which is why it's deeper reds there. So potentially problematic from a trail vulnerability standpoint. Finally, we have natural soil loss. And I put natural soil loss because this is basically, if we remove all other things from the equation, if we're just looking at the natural environment, like rainfall and other things, that's what we're calculating here. And we have an equation, an established equation for that, called the Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation. It was developed by the USDA to basically quantify agricultural crop soil erosion, but has been used and adopted in various ways and forms throughout the years. And we used it here to quantify soil loss on trails naturally. And so basically it calculates the annual average soil loss in tons per hectare per year using things like rainfall erosivity, which you can think of rainfall erosivity as basically the intensity of rainfall and the duration of rainfall. It's kind of a combined thing. Soil erodibility is that soil properties thing, where we're looking at soil particle size, soil type, which is a big factor in Hawaii when we have, basically soil that is not developed in young lava flows, all the way to soil on Kauai that's very well developed. And so it's really important to consider that. We have the slope length and steepness, and that's different from the trail grade. And that slope length and steepness is basically considering the slope around the area. So if we're at the bottom of a steep hill, it's considering everything upslope in these calculations and contributing to the soil loss at the area. And then finally, land cover is basically a cover factor. So if in the context of this study, we used it considering vegetation. And so vegetation is basically a stopgap to rainfall. If we're hiking on a trail that has vegetation over the top of it, the rain falling on that trail is basically going to be mitigated or stopped because there's vegetation over it. Whereas if you have a really exposed trail, that rainfall is directly hitting the trail and increases erosional rates. And then we're going to disregard the conservation practice factor because that's an agriculturally focused factor that basically has to do with like tilling rates and conservation agricultural practices. So we were able to calculate annual soil loss across all 150 plus program trails. And so now we have all of these different data sources that contribute to trail vulnerability, but they're not really comparable in their current form. For example, trail slope alignment angle is measured in degrees, trail grade is measured in percentages, we have annual soil loss, which is tons per hectare per year, and we really need a way to consolidate all of these things so that we can quantify trail vulnerability. And so what we did is we came up with a weighted ranking system using published literature and also our own intuition. And so we went through all of these different data sources and basically ranked them on a weighted scale. So for example, if trail grade was exceeding 15%, which is kind of a cutoff for trail sustainability building standards, that would rank the highest on our category, let's say a 5. And then for trail slope alignment angle, similarly, those fault aligned trails, if they were basically running directly upslope, those would also be ranked as a 5. And so this way we can basically compare and contrast across these different categories. And then we made an additive model combining all of these things, and that's what we're coining trail vulnerability here. So I'm going to provide some overview results from this study. It's pretty hard to get into the nitty-gritty of 150 plus program trails, but I do have an interactive map that I'm hoping to spend a little bit of time in and kind of give you all some ideas of how we can use the data. But I did want to give you some summary results. These are the top 5 trails across the state for trail use using that cell phone data. And so, 3 are on Oahu, 1 is on Maui, 1 is on Hawaii Island. That was surprising to me. Going into this, I would have thought that the top 5 trails would have all been on Oahu, just based on population and visitors and things like that. But actually, the second ranked trail, Waihe'e, is on Maui, and then the 4th ranked trail, Makaulu'ooma, is on Hawaii Island. And so, interestingly, if we look at the usage on these trails, 30% of all program trail use was distributed across these 5 trails. And so the remaining 70% of trail use was distributed across 145-ish trails. And so these are really high use, high volume trails that are important to consider from a trail use perspective. Trail design, again, this is the trail grade and the trail slope alignment angle. We found that over 85 miles of approximately 500 miles of trails were fault aligned, and so that's basically the trails going straight up slope. That's about 17% of those trails. We found that over 126 of 500 miles of trail exceeded a 15% grade, which makes sense. We have really steep terrain here, and likely we're going to have really steep trails. So potentially problematic from a trail design standpoint. But it's also really important to consider all of the other contributing factors, because this doesn't tell the full story. And I'll give you an example here. This is the worst ranked trail based on trail slope alignment angle, the Ainapo Trail on Hawaii Island, basically going straight up the slope of Mauna Loa. You can see basically almost the entirety of that trail is in red because it's going directly up slope, and that's really not what we want from a trail sustainability building standpoint. But we don't really actually have many problems on this trail from a trail vulnerability standpoint. It ranks fairly lowly when we look at overall trail vulnerability, and that's because, like I said, it has very young soils. It's a young lava flow, and so from an erosional standpoint, not very many issues when we consider the other factors. Looking at soil loss, this is across the 150 plus program trails, and again, this is natural soil loss. So remove all people from the equation, all hiking, everything else. If we just looked at the trail itself with natural conditions like rainfall and everything else, we found that across all of those trails, there's about 88 tons a year of soil loss under natural conditions, which may or may not sound like a lot. And if we think in terms of dump trucks, we see 13 dump trucks there, which doesn't seem like too much, right? This is natural conditions. Maybe that's an acceptable amount. But one of the big things that we were interested in is, what if we factor in the thousands or if not millions of people visiting these trails every year? And unfortunately, there's not like an established factor that we can apply to that 88 tons a year. But based on published studies, it ranges anywhere from 10 to 100 times the background rates of soil erosion if we include, trail usage. And so if we run with those numbers and we use that small number, the 10, that's about 135 dump trucks a year coming off those trails. And if we run with the midpoint, let's say 50 times the natural soil erosion rates, we're looking at 675 dump trucks a year. And so we're starting to get into scary territory when we talk about trail erosion, if we're considering usage and everything like that. And here's where I did want to walk you through the interactive map and how it can help inform decisions. And so this is getting into the trail vulnerability estimates and things from all of those combined factors that I mentioned previously. And so I'm going to attempt to bring up our interactive map here, and I'm going to walk you through 3 different example trails. And we're going to start with Kaiwa Ridge on the windward side of Oahu. Many people probably know it as Lanikai Pillboxes. And so this is Kaiwa Ridge here. And so we have, if you'll notice these tabs here, I'm going to walk you through. These are all of the different contributing factors to trail vulnerability. And we're going to start with annual soil loss. And so the color palettes for all of these and the scales are at the bottom right. And by and large, and interestingly, when I first started looking into this, natural soil loss rates in this area are really low, which might come as a huge surprise because if anybody's hiked that trail, it's incredibly rutted and has huge erosion problems. So natural soil loss is pretty low. If we look at trail use type, again, we get average erosion potential based on use. That's basically because most of this trail is foot traffic. We obviously don't have four-wheel drivers going up there or anything, so fairly low ranking if we think of trail use type. Trail counts. This is the big hitter here. There's very high use, and as I showed before, this is actually the highest use trail based on the cell phone data that we got. So a huge potential problem from a trail vulnerability standpoint. Very high use on this trail. If we look at trail slope alignment angle, so this is on a green to red scale. Basically, green areas are pretty good from a trail slope alignment angle perspective, and red are bad. We can see that large sections of this trail are pretty good from a trail slope alignment angle. There are certain sections where we might want to prioritize management if we're thinking about management solutions for trail slope alignment angle, like kind of redesigning the trail to not go straight up slope. But by and large, trail slope alignment angle isn't super problematic on this trail. If we're looking at trail grade, again, this is a potential problem here. A lot of sections of this trail exceed that 15% grade, and so are potentially problematic there. And then finally, if we look at the combined impacts of all of these things, the trail vulnerability, it falls into the severe vulnerability category based on the combined impacts of all of those things relative to all of our other trails across the state. And so if we come back to the slides here, and we want to rank these things based on those broad categories of trail use, trail design, and natural soil loss, trail use ranks the highest. If we're thinking about management solutions, we might want to think of managing use on that trail above anything else. Trail design is kind of moderate. You know, there were trail grade issues and potentially some trail slope alignment issues. But really the big hitter there is the trail use. And then, interestingly, natural soil loss in that area was pretty low. And so, yeah, really the use and the design on this trail. If we look at Hawaii Loa Trail, and I'll pull that up in a minute, but if you're familiar with this trail, this is a ridge trail. That trail bed that I'm hiking on there should be about 6-7 feet higher on the ridge line, but because of erosion, it's kind of eroded out into a slot canyon looking thing. And so I'm going to pull up that trail on the interactive map here. I think it's actually got stuff wrong. So we're going to zoom out to annual soil loss. And so, sorry, it's kind of small, but it's this trail in the middle here. And if we follow it up, similar to Kaiwa Ridge, soil loss is pretty low. The natural soil loss rates are pretty low in this area, down in the yellow categories there. Trail use type is also really low. This is foot traffic only, and so not really problematic from a trail type of use perspective. If we're looking at trail counts on this trail based on that cell phone data are also very low. So not super popular hike here. But if we look at trail slope alignment angle, this trail is pretty problematic from a trail design perspective. Most sections of this trail are red. And you'll see this for a majority of our ridgeline hikes. They go straight up the slope. And so from a trail design perspective, that's not ideal. And so it might be something worth addressing there. And then trail grade, we can identify certain sections of the trail that are potentially too steep from a trail sustainable buildings perspective, especially this top section here. And if you ever hike this trail, it basically goes straight up to the Ko'olau summit. And so if we look at vulnerability overall, it's not as bad as Ka'iva Ridge if we're considering all of those different contributing factors. It ranks in the, low to moderate. Some sections are severely vulnerable, but not as high as the Ka'iva Ridge Trail. But if we want to look at all the categories, really the issue on this trail is trail design. It's relatively low use, and natural soil loss rates are low, but the design is going to be the issue there. And finally, very close to us right now in Mānoa Valley, and apologies to anybody online if you're joining Zoom. I only have examples from Oahu. I'm happy to pull up the interactive map and look at any other trails if there's time at the end. But Manoa Falls, again, if we look at that on the interactive map, well, first looking at trail vulnerability, severely vulnerable at large sections of this trail. And so what might be the causes of that? Annual soil loss or natural soil loss in the area is actually pretty high. So this is some of the highest soil loss rates that we saw across many trails in the state. And so we're kind of starting off in a problematic area if we're thinking about a trail here. The natural soil loss rates are pretty high, and so there's going to be some inherent issues when we're thinking about hiking through that area. Trail use type, again, it's average. There's not like four-wheel drive or anything crazy like that here. Trail counts are very high, not quite as high as Ka'iva Ridge, but ranking in the very high category. And then trail slope alignment angle, we can see, there are large stretches of this trail that are really good from a slope alignment angle perspective, but then some others that are potentially problematic and might need addressing. And then trail grade. Most of the beginning of this trail is fine from a trail grade perspective, and then it gets pretty steep there at the end. And so if we're looking at Manoa Falls and looking at the ranking, there's a lot of different things that are contributing to the vulnerability of that trail and that potentially need to be addressed. And so with that, I did want to kind of leave off and have time for questions, but I did want to say, outdoor recreation is great. I think it presented a lot of kind of scary, daunting things here, especially when it comes to soil loss and all of those things, but I highly encourage outdoor recreation. I think everybody has a right to access the outdoors and hike wonderful trails. I think the really encouraging thing about working in this recreational trail space is that solutions do exist. And so, like I mentioned, soil loss might be a problem in the area, or overuse might be a problem in the area, but we have solutions to those things, and tools like this just help make those kinds of decisions and build more transparency in decision making. I think overall, because this was a statewide project, it kind of illustrates the need across all of our counties really to better support recreational trails and the recreational trail program. And this is just an additional tool for proactive preventative action. And so with that, did want to plug 2 talks coming up. One of our graduate students in our lab, Wade Nagua, is presenting on Access Year in a couple of weeks. And then Valdo, who's actually joining us today, is presenting kind of that recreational economics component of this overall project. So highly encourage attending those 2 talks. But I will leave it there. I don't know, we probably have time for questions and things, but yeah, thank you.